The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse like an angry fist, each drop carrying the weight of Richard Blackstone's fury. At 62, he had built an empire that stretched across 3 continents, crushed competitors without a second thought, and neither not Onsia had anyone dared to silence him. Tonight, that was about to change. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Richard's voice boomed across the marble-floored living room, his face crimson with rage as he jabbed his finger at the small woman standing quietly by the door. "I've destroyed careers for less than this. I've ruined families who dared to cross me. No one shuts me up." The object of his wrath was Maria Santos, a 54-year-old housekeeper who had worked in the Blackstone mansion for exactly 3 weeks. Her weathered hands, calloused from decades of honest labor, remained folded calmly in front of her uniform. Her dark eyes, though tired from a double shift, held something that Richard had rarely encountered in his 6 decades of existence: a complete fearlessness. The confrontation had started over something trivial, as most devastating moments do. Richard had been berating a young waiter at his dinner party earlier that evening, reducing the college student to tears over a dropped wine glass. The guests are politicians, CEOs, socialites had watched in uncomfortable silence, their champagne flutes trembling slightly in their hands. It was the kind of scene that played out regularly in Richard's world, where power was wielded like a weapon and kindness was seen as weakness. But Maria had witnessed it all from the doorway where she'd been quietly collecting empty plates. And when the last guest had left, when the echoes of forced laughter had faded into the night, she had done something unprecedented. She had asked to speak with him. "Mr. Blackstone," she had said in her soft, accented English, "I need to talk to you about what happened tonight." That's when Richard had exploded. That's when the roaring had begun. For 20 minutes, he had unleashed a torrent of threats, insults, and intimidation tactics that had served him well in boardrooms across the globe. He had reminded Maria of her immigrant status, her lack of education, her complete dependence on his goodwill for her job. He had painted vivid pictures of her unemployment, her struggle, her failure. But Maria hadn't moved. She hadn't flinched. She had simply waited. Now, as Richard's voice finally cracked from the exertion of his rage, as his face began to return to its normal color, Maria stepped forward. The storm outside seemed to pause, as if nature itself was holding its breath for what came next. "Are you finished, Mr. Blackstone?" she asked quietly. The question was so simple, so devoid of malice or fear, that it stopped Richard cold. In all his years of intimidation, no one had ever asked him that. They had cowered, apologized, pleaded, but never simply asked if he was done with his tantrum. Richard began, but the words died in his throat. Maria nodded once, as if accepting his silence as an answer, and continued. "My son Miguel is 22 years old. He's studying engineering at the community college downtown at the same age as that boy you made cry tonight." Her voice remained steady, conversational. "Miguel works 3 jobs to pay for his education. He stocks shelves at night, delivers groceries on weekends, and tutors children in math during the week." Richard frowned, confused by this apparent non sequitur. "What does your son have to do with her?" "Last month," Maria continued, raising her hand gently to stop him, "Miguel was working his grocery delivery job when he knocked on her door in Beacon Hill. An elderly man answered her, sick, alone, clearly struggling. The delivery was wrong. It wasn't for that address. Miguel could have simply left and moved on to his next stop." She paused, looking directly into Richard's eyes. "Instead, he went to the store with his own money and bought groceries for that old man. He was 2 hours late finishing his route that night. His supervisor docked his pay." The rain continued its assault on the windows, but the sound seemed distant now, muffled by the weight of Maria's words. "The next week, Miguel went back to check on the man. He brought soup that I had made. The week after that, he brought his textbooks and did his homework at the old man's kitchen table, just so he wouldn't be alone. Maria's eyes glistened, but her voice never wavered. He never told me about any of this. I only found out when the man's daughter called to thank our family after her father passed away last Tuesday. Richard felt something strange happening in his chest, to a tightness he hadn't experienced in years. I still don't understand what this has to do with that young man tonight, Maria said softly. Someone's son. Someone raised him, worried about him, sacrificed for him. When you crushed his spirit over an accident, you didn't just hurt him, you hurt his mother, who probably worked double shifts to put him through college. You hurt his little sister, who looks up to him. You hurt his girlfriend, who loves him exactly as he is. The words hung in the air like smoke, and Richard found himself thinking of things he hadn't considered in decades. When had he last thought about the waiter as someone's son? When had he last considered that his employees had families, dreams, fears that existed beyond their service to him? My Miguel, Maria continued, he's never met you, Mr. Blackstone. He doesn't know that you employ his mother. But if he did, if he saw how you treat people tonight, it would break his heart. Not because he's weak, but because he's been raised to believe that every person matters, that every human being deserves dignity. Richard's legs felt suddenly unsteady. He sank into the leather chair behind him, his empire of certainty crumbling like a house of cards. I have worked for many wealthy families, Maria said, moving closer but not threateningly. Some were kind, some were not. But you, Mr. Blackstone, you're the first one I've met who seems to have forgotten that money can't buy what matters most. And what's that? Richard asked, his voice barely a whisper. Maria smiled then, and it transformed her entire face. The ability to sleep peacefully at night, knowing you've added more kindness to the world than you've taken away. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard stared at this woman, this housekeeper he had dismissed as insignificant, and realized she possessed a wealth he had never even comprehended. She had raised a son who bought groceries for strangers. She had worked her fingers raw to provide for her family while somehow maintaining enough compassion to worry about the feelings of people she barely knew. I don't know how to be that person, Richard admitted, the words torn from somewhere deep inside him. Yes, you do, Maria said gently. You just forgot. The man who built hospitals in 3 countries, the one who started the scholarship program for underprivileged kids, he's still in there, Mr. Blackstone. He's just been buried under years of believing that being feared is the same as being respected. Richard looked up at her with new eyes. How did you know about the hospitals? The scholarships? I asked around before I took this job. I wanted to understand who I was working for. Maria's smile grew warmer. You've helped more people than you remember, Mr. Blackstone. But somewhere along the way, you stopped doing it with your heart and started doing it with your wallet. As if on cue, the rain began to soften against the windows. Richard stood slowly, walked to his desk, and picked up his phone. With trembling fingers, he scrolled through his contacts until he found what he was looking for. David. It's Richard Blackstone. I know it's late, but I need the contact information for that young man who was serving at my dinner party tonight. Yes, I know it's unusual. No, he's not in trouble. I need to apologize. When he hung up, Maria was already putting on her coat. Where are you going? Richard asked. Home to my son, she replied. It's late, and he worries when I work long hours. Maria, Richard called as she reached the door. She turned back to him. Thank you for not shutting up when I told you to. She laughed then, a sound like silver bells that filled the vast, lonely penthouse with something it had been missing for years. My Miguel always says that the most important conversations are the ones we're afraid to have. Mr. Blackstone. Have a good evening." As the door closed behind her, Richard Blackstone stood alone in his empire of marble and gold, finally understanding that the richest person in the room had just left. Tomorrow, he would begin the long journey of remembering who he used to be. Tonight, he would call his own son for the first time in 3 years. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, and the first stars were beginning to appear through the breaking clouds.